Hello. Thank you for joining us for this first round of breakout sessions today. My name is Christina Davis, and I am a researcher at the American Institutes for Research, where I work on the NAEP Assessment Operations team, primarily supporting the NAEP reading assessment. Before I introduce our presenter, I want to let you know that I will be moderating a question and answer session after the presentation. I will take questions from the chat space, so please type your questions in the chat as they arise. I would also like to note that any resources provided for this session are available in the website resource file. I am thrilled to introduce Dr. Elfrieda Hiebert as our presenter today. Freddy is the president and CEO of Text Project, which is a nonprofit providing open access resources for the instruction of beginning and struggling readers. She is a well-established contributor to literacy education, with her experience ranging from teaching primary and college-level students to publishing award-winning research addressing how fluency, vocabulary, and knowledge can be fostered through appropriate texts. Today, Freddy will present her work on vocabulary, the key to unlocking text. This presentation has been pre-recorded, but I will join you again live to moderate a question and answer session at the conclusion of the presentation. With that said, I am happy to turn the session over to Dr. Hiebert.
Hi, thanks for joining me to talk about vocabulary. Vocabulary is at the very center of what we do as educators. Knowledge is all about ideas. And how do we know an idea? By its label, its vocabulary. How we do as readers, how we do as learners in mathematics, social studies, and science has to do with the extent and the depth of our vocabularies. Now, how does this relate to the National Assessment of Educational Progress that I'm certain you've heard about at some point in this conference already? We know that about 35% of our students are below basic, 35% are proficient. And we can ask the question, what does vocabulary have to do with this? Well, we read passages and we need to know about the words, the ideas in these passages. In this example here, it's about 18% of the whole text. And it fits the pattern of a number of words that students likely haven't seen in text before. Now, that doesn't mean that they aren't in their oral vocabularies, but they have to be able to decode the words to see if they are in their oral vocabularies. Some of these words, like ins, may not be in their oral vocabularies, even though it's a word that's really easy to decode. Other words may be somewhat more difficult to decode, like dwindled. And it may be that students really haven't ever heard that word before. And when they decode it, they can't figure out if it's accurate. Now, what happens to the students who aren't proficient with the 2,500 morphological families that account for the majority of the words? Those are the words in gold. What if you don't know the words sparingly? Or what if you can't decode, and even if you can, don't know the word approached? What I'm going to look at today is how knowledge of vocabulary influences word recognition and comprehension. And I'm going to ask a couple of questions. I know that you're sitting there somewhere by yourself, but I hope that you have something to write on and can answer some of these questions. And the first question really has to do with the way in which we typically teach vocabulary. So here are 8, that are in a current core reading program. What do you think the theme of this text is? Examined, peak, fondly, steep, rugged, missed, pausing, and pleaded. Well, in the past, people have said that with rugged and peak, Maybe people are climbing somewhere. Missed, examined, pleading, not so sure. Well, it turns out that these 8 words are the ones that are recommended for instruction of these 2 texts. The one on the left, The Trail of Tears, tells the story of the Cherokees being removed from their homes and taken to another place. And the second is a Cherokee legend. I wondered about why these choices were made. Let's just go back to this for a minute. Do we think that students don't know the word peak or fondly or steep? I mean, if you can figure that word out, and that's a fairly simple word, relatively easy word for a 3rd grader, and this is intended for 3rd graders, to decode, do we think that we can't explain that to them quickly? It turns out that English has a massive vocabulary, larger than most languages. So in the definitive Oxford English Dictionary, there are about 616,000 entry words. And an entry in the dictionary can also be the source for a couple of different meanings. So if you think of even a word like root or head, it can have a couple of different meanings. These are all of the words in the unit in which these 8 words were selected. So I asked myself, why these 8? And is that the way in which we can most support students in getting into getting proficient with this massive vocabulary we have in English? Here I am in 2004, same office, but it looks a little different. And I asked the question, is it possible to identify a parsimonious, and by that I meant an economical, a vocabulary that could really close the vocabulary gap? And this is what I did. I had about 10,000 texts scanned. Now I've got about 12,000 texts. And I applied these texts to a word analyzer, an app that I had for somebody developed for me. And I tell you, these aren't that hard to develop. And in my word analyzer, at the present time, I've got about 12 characteristics of words. So in a nanosecond, I can tell you about the distribution of words in a text, but I can also tell you about words like ruined and feast. And when we look at these words, we see that they have an approximately same length. They appear about the same times in written English. They occur about the same time, ruined a little bit earlier, apparently, than feast in kids' oral language environments. Ruin has a slightly bigger family of words around the root word ruin. And there's a mean concreteness that the range is from 1, very abstract, to 5, which is completely concrete. Okay, so what do you think? This is the second question. What do you think I found about a parsimonious vocabulary? I was setting about asking, are there some words that merit instruction more than others? Well, what I found was that there were about 2,500 word families, and a word family is like help, helper, helped, helpful, unhelpful. So each of these word families actually has an average of about 6 members. So this yellow group is big. It's not as big in number as the light purple and the dark purple, but it makes a very, very big difference in the text that students read. So if you aren't proficient by 4th grade on the NAEP with those words in yellow, you're in some trouble. And then it turned, because why? You're going to see a lot of different words. I showed you some of those purple words in the example from 5 boiled eggs. And here we see that there are probably about 200,000 words that appear with frequency of less than once per million words of text. Okay, so I was interested in how are our kids doing with these words in the yellow group, and then how can we help them with the words that are rarer but are really critical to the flavor of narrative text and to the information and informational text. What I did with my colleagues Amanda Goodwin and Gina Cervetti is we took all of the text from the Common Core State Standards exemplars. Do you remember those in one of the appendices, things that the Common Core writers thought exemplified the kinds of text kids should read? And we asked, do these words, the 2,500 morphological families, are they critical across the grade levels? And here's what we found. We found that about 13,000 of them accounted for about 97% of the words in grade 1 text. And even, I am so sorry that I have a hyperactive mouse, but even into grade 11 to college and career, we see that these words continue to be critical. New words are added across time, but what we're seeing is that the core vocabulary keeps being important. Let me give you some examples. Here's something that we might give, and each of these are about 100 words long. Here's whistle for Willie. And what you see here are, they're typically, unless the text has been written to be very controlled, there are going to be some purple words. We think that, for example, winked is something that children in 1st grade could decode. Maybe not carton, but if we talk about carton, that's something that they probably know about. Here's about grade 2, 3. We keep at that rate of rare words, but here you're seeing some of these words are more unusual. A word like runt or hog house, which for most kids at this point in history isn't going to be very familiar. We're going now into about grade 5. The words are getting a little bit longer, most of them. We see that there are going to be some proper names, but again, the same level of rare words keeps appearing. They just get rarer, the rare words do, and they get longer. And we also know that for students who struggle in reading, longer is going to be harder. And here we have something at about the grade 7 level. It's not that we have more purple words, it's just the frequency of those purple words, the likelihood you've encountered them in your oral language starts to diminish. And the same thing is true with the assessments we give students. In my state of California, we use SBAC, and here are some examples from that assessment where you're seeing same level of rare words. Here, the level is a little higher, and the words like penchant and spree are pretty difficult, but you're also seeing a lot of proper names. So the core vocabulary I'm suggesting, when I looked at that text at the beginning, 5 boiled eggs from the National Assessment, we focus a lot on the purple words, but if students aren't proficient with the most frequent words, and I'm not talking about the Dolch words here, those words account for about 1% of the 2,500 families. I'm talking about words, and keep remembering, each of these represents a family. Discovery represents discover, discoverer, and so on. Now, having established this, what my premise here is that you've got to be really automatic with the meanings of the core vocabulary. If you're not, that's going to be really problematic, because in most texts, you're going to see 3 to 4 of the purple words in every 100 words you read. So in 5 boiled eggs, that text is almost 700 words long. You're going to see a lot of purple words. In those 2 texts that I showed you on the Cherokee Trail of Tears, it turned out there were dozens and dozens of words kids likely hadn't encountered. And there were some choices made. Were those the best choices? And I'm suggesting that we need to think about how our students are doing with the core vocabulary. And then we need to be teaching them some things about the words that are rare and how they relate and have similar features to the words in the core vocabulary. So my third question is, why doesn't teaching these words as a list work? So once people heard that I had identified these words, I started, and keep remembering, it's not just a set of words, it's 2,500 morphological word families. I started getting many requests like, I want the list. And I was saying, I don't think so. First of all, I didn't want to be the next Dolch. And I was convinced that teaching words as a list didn't work. Why do you think teaching these words as a list wouldn't work? I'm going to give you a little wait time to think about this. Well, some of you are going to say that there's no context, and that's completely true. There is no context. Furthermore, these words in the core vocabulary, this is so incredible. Well, really it isn't. Maybe everybody knew this, but it took me this well over a decade to figure this out. But it turns out that there are clusters of ideas that are common. You know, words around health and the human body, words around machines. And what we want to do is learn how those words connect to each other, not just learn them piecemeal, one at a time. So there are these critical areas of content, and I'm going to show you a place where I've actually made the words available, but not as a list. In the case of the topic knowledge, I've made them available as sets of word pictures. So you can actually teach kids about the words as concepts. A second point is, remember, these are morphological families, and they represent the different ways in which we generate new words in written English. Now, remember, English is a little different than lots of languages in that it is based on Anglo-Saxon words, which are Germanic in character. But on top of that, we have words from the Romance languages. So at one point, England was conquered by people who spoke a form of French. And these 2 groups of words, this is why we have so many words in English. These 2 groups of words, linguistic origin groups, form words in very different ways. You know, a word like field, if you think about battlefield, that is a place where we do battles. But an airfield is not just a field of air. Okay, so in Anglo-Saxon, new words are made by compounding. In Romance languages, they're made through derivatives, through prefixes and suffixes. So separate, separable, separation. And then to top off the pyramid, we have Greek and Latin words. These are words that are typically technical and appear in many languages. It's a different form of compounding than in the Anglo-Saxon. So here you're seeing like the word graph. Para doesn't hang out by itself, or it doesn't connect with words in the same way that graph does, but graph has the same meaning every time you see it, which is very different than the Anglo-Saxon. So what we need to be teaching students to get proficient with, both the core vocabulary and then the many rare words beyond that, is that 1, we have topics. 2, we have morphological families. And 3, a lot of these words are highly frequent because they have a couple of different meanings, at least a few meanings. And here's an example with the word shape, where when you use it in mathematics, it has a very different meaning than if a story is saying an idea took shape in the character's mind. Okay, so we want to actually develop these understandings in students, actually from the get-go. So what are ways to grow students' vocabularies? And I'm going to give you a minute or two to think about that. Well, I'm certain you have your favorite ways. I'm going to give you some ways that build on these ideas that words are in topic families, they're in morphological families, and they also have multiple meanings. So I asked the question, what are ways to grow students' vocabularies? Well, let me give you some ways that are based on these ideas that we've talked about. Words are about ideas. And what we want to do is build students' knowledge through the text they read, through the vocabulary they're seeing in text. Let me share with you what I call a knowledge-centered approach. So here's some books that are around whales and around deep sea and exploring the ocean. Okay, these texts are different. 2 of them are informational, 2 of them are stories, but they're around a topic. Okay, deep sea exploration, especially around whales. Now, I'm going to show you some texts here that are entirely good texts, but they have, I call them knowledge diffuse. They have different topics, every single text. And when you have a different topic for every single text, it means that you're going to have a different vocabulary. So here are the words around the whale or deep sea creatures. And what you're seeing is some of the words are going to be repeated. I haven't shown you the repeated words here, but it's really important to see words across different contexts. But what you're seeing here is that we keep adding to these ideas of marine mammals survival, creatures, and ideas about whales specifically. That's really different in the knowledge diffuse. Now, in the knowledge diffuse, these are not bad sets of words. The point is you aren't developing a map, a set of ideas around concepts. Every single text is demanding a new vocabulary. And what we know is that knowledge makes a big difference in comprehension. And we want to develop bodies of knowledge for students through text, but also the notion that texts have these bodies of knowledge to be gained. Now, let me give you some examples. The first example comes is really for beginning readers. And this process of knowledge building through vocabulary can start early on. These are some texts that I'll give you the URL for at the end. They're open access, which means they're free for you to use in your classrooms. And they have to do with a set of texts around animal senses. Okay, and these same three animals, a snail, a bird, and an elephant, are carried through. So in this text, it's about touch, how people touch the earth and move. In this text, it's about sight. And one of the things that we want to do, so we've seen certain ideas across all of these texts, but unique ideas too, because snails and eagles and elephants, their eyesight works a little bit differently. But what we want to do is keep pulling out the important ideas, the important vocabulary in ways for students to reflect, and also, and this is really critical, to store that knowledge. Okay, we want students to know this is important, this is worth knowing, and also look at what you've gained through text. And this is at the very earliest stages. I can give you a couple of other examples. Here are some other. This is one of the texts from Text Project, Talking Points for Kids, supplemented with a book called The 10 Top Ways You Can Reduce Waste and a magazine article about trashing paradise. So what we want to do is support kids in always keeping a record of the ideas. This is about what I've learned. So it's not just a static record, it's something we can keep adding to. Here's a third idea, a concept, and I don't want you to think that what I've been talking about only applies to informational text. When I talk about knowledge, I'm also talking about the knowledge that you gain from stories. You gain a lot from stories. Stories are where you learn about the human condition and how humans have responded historically or ways in which humans would like to respond, which is an example of Mama's Window. The other two texts here are actually biographical. But stories tell us things, give us ideas about how we respond to obstacles. And again, always a place of recording your ideas. I'd love for these to be on apps where kids can keep revisiting what they know about accomplishing goals or about how animal features support them in different kinds of environments. Okay, so one way we support vocabulary is through clustering of topics and through keeping records of what it is that we've learned through those topics. A second thing that we want to do is we want to ensure that beginning and struggling readers have a lot of experience with the core vocabulary. And this is a little tough because if every text I look at has 3 to 5 words that I haven't seen before, some of which are in my oral language, some of them that aren't, it's hard for me to get proficient with the core vocabulary. And this reflects something I've written about extensively, which was a real sea change that was made in American textbooks in the early 1990s. So what I've done in response to that is at Text Project, I've created sets of texts. So here are sets of texts on stories of kids who have made a difference. I think that's a really important thing for children to know. But FYI for kids isn't only about this dimension. It also has stories about how words are created, like compounding of words, or how different art projects are made. Okay, so, but what is extended through all of these texts is that there's a higher than usual percentage of the core vocabulary. And when words that aren't in the core vocabulary are present, those words are repeated. So for example, softball is going to, or the word mound are going to be repeated in these texts. So kids get the opportunity to get really good at the core vocabulary, but also attending to new words. We have very little repetition in our current English language arts texts, and that creates obstacles for the kids who learn to read in schools. So what I'm suggesting, I provided these sets of text. Here's another one called Talking Points for Kids, in which there are about 6 or 7 texts around something that kids care about, like physical education, or do we keep animals in zoos, or should you be able to bring toys to school? As I also showed you before, the beginning reads is another example of one of these sets of text where words are repeated. In the case of this unit, there are 12 sets of books, and you have the word snail across a lot of these books, nose across a lot of these books, and the word smell. Okay, we've talked about one, clustering texts around topics. That way, kids are developing vocabularies around topics. Second, I've said, for some students, it really helps to have texts where you get the opportunity, where you aren't always having to attend to the really rare words, where you get to see the most common, well, not common, but the most frequent sets of words repeated. But we also want to make some of this very explicit with students. And one of the ways we do that is through clustering groups of words from the text students are reading. So remember, I told you that in Trail of Tears and Yonder Mountain, 8 words were picked for these 2 texts, but there were an enormous number of words that we know from applying research principles. We know a lot about the kinds of words that are hard for students who aren't very proficient readers. Words like enemies and survivor, words that have multiple syllables, and that often, like a word like elders, might not be in their oral reading. And it turns out in stories, the critical words fall into the structure of stories. So in stories, we've got characters. We've also got action. There's always action in stories. And what I'm displaying here, what I'm showing you, is that rather than just having that one word pleated as an example of action, there are others really important related words for actions in this text, like removal and marching and buried. People needed to bury their dead as they went on this march. Another part of stories is the context. And here we've got some, we've got the word peak, but it isn't just sitting by itself. They had steep trails. They walked for long distances. There was Yonder Mountain. There were also some proper names, and often we don't attend to proper names, and those can cause challenges for students. And finally, there are events and features in stories. One of the important parts in this text has to do with the Indian Removal Act, treaties. So remember those words that were so idiosyncratic. It's not that some of them weren't important, but it's the context in which we're learning them. So what have we talked about? I've talked about, and where in the world did I get the word score vocabulary at Text Project? I have no idea. Excuse me for that error. But when we think about the vocabulary that's challenging for students, we need to ensure that they have a foundation in reading a lot. And one of the ways in which you develop vocabularies is ensuring that you have them read around texts with a common topic. That's really, really important. And as I showed with the beginning reads, that starts from the very early stages. And we want to have records of that. We want to give kids opportunities, and we've got about 400 text project that can help students ensuring that they get better at this core vocabulary. And we also want to have lessons where we're explicit about expanding your vocabulary. So let me tell you about some of the things that we have at Text Project. The Core Vocabulary Project actually has all the 2,500 families, but in clusters of topics, because that's how words matter. And as part of this, we also have morphological maps. And finally, we have multiple meaning maps. Remember, everything at Text Project is open access, which means you can use it in your classrooms. We also have something called word pictures. Okay, the word pictures take the very concrete parts of the core vocabulary, they cluster them, and they provide examples of illustrations and sentences that you can talk about. Now, in closing today, I want to point out that obviously I have a passion for vocabulary, but my passion for vocabulary has to do with ideas. And one of the things after the 15 months that we've gone through as a world is we need to inspire and support our students in seeing what's possible in the world. And here's some collections of books. This one is about Asian American women, books that I absolutely adore. I'm not suggesting a canon of books all kids should read, but I am suggesting that there are books related to your communities or expanding your kids' communities, books that have to do with music. Everybody resonates to music. Books that have to do with art. Incredible children's literature we have available. Books that have to do with food. And if there's one book that I have just loved during this pandemic, it's Chef Roy Choi. It is a fabulous book about an immigrant and the contributions to our cuisine. So here's Text Project. So where you can find us is textproject.org. I also want to tell you that here's an article that was in the Reading Teacher on the core vocabulary, and it, like everything else that I've thought of or know, is open access. So you should be able to get that at both Text Project and also at the International Literacy Association. It's in the Reading Teacher. For what you do and who you are, I'm going to just finish off here by, I hope this works. Thanking you for being such great listeners and for what you do for our future. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation there. As someone who works on NAEP reading and has had the opportunity to see how much context can affect meaning vocabulary, this was very, very exciting for me to see. So I'm actually going to see if we get any questions in the chat here while we wait. But I did want to ask you, as someone who's very invested in the NAEP world, what do you see to be the most urgent need in terms of changing the percentages of students who are scoring below basic on NAEP? And is there any evidence that that's actually possible?
I think we
Sorry, that's a
really,
big question, right?
yeah, it is. We really need to attend to the text that our kids are reading. So through some of these sessions, I've been hearing about the use of some texts, especially during the pandemic, that are online that sometimes are not necessarily the most well thought out texts. Often we give students, keep remembering, it doesn't matter if it's a grade 1 level text or a text at Newsela, that's at 1,000 Lexile. In relation to the core vocabulary, you're always, per every 100 words, have 3 to 4 rare words. So if the passage is, 1,000 words long, that means probably 40. And that 40 doesn't include in there the fact that some of the rare words will be repeated. So sometimes it looks harder. And if you don't read a lot, it's a statistical issue, actually. You just haven't encountered the words enough to get very good at them. So when we look at students at the very beginning stages who have gotten books where 40% of the words appear a single time, which is the percentage in American beginning reading text, whether they're leveled, decodable, or core reading programs, and we can provide the data on that. If you're getting such a volume of words you haven't seen, you don't see again for a long time, it's really, really hard to get automatic with the words that matter most. So it's a matter of reading a lot, and some kids have been read to a lot and read a lot. And for them, that task looks pretty easy. But for the kids who learn to read in school, we have to remember that the amount of data they've been getting is just enormous. And especially when you go from topic to topic to topic. And I think of that with the program, some of the programs that I've just mentioned, it's overwhelming. I mean, my project during the pandemic has been to learn my native language, which is German. So my family, I went through the language learning period about the same time that my oldest sibling started school, and the teacher said, don't speak German at home. So it's basically, I've lost my language. And I have to tell you, I have to see words repeated to learn them. If a text has 40% words that are new and I don't see them again, that's really hard. So I'm saying we have to think about the text. It's a diet. I mean, text, we can do all kinds of activities with words and all kinds of skills that are needed. But eventually you have to read, and you have to read a lot, but what you read matters. So just saying it's complex isn't enough. We have to think of the design of the text and what the kids know about those texts.
That actually, I don't see any questions in the chat, so I'm going to keep going with my own questions here. I used to be an elementary reading teacher, and I used to actually have to Dibbles test my students every week. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if you've taken a look at some of this, like with the vocabulary and the word families and the word repetition in relation to like the Dibbles testing or those other kind of diagnostic tests that we're giving the young kids, because I imagine they're running into words there that if they're not seeing them repeated, they'd also be struggling with.
We published at the beginning, I think it was the beginning of this year. Sometimes I forget what I've published and when I published it, but we published a paper, and I'm happy to post that in the resources, called Unknown and Known Words for First Graders. So we actually looked at a cohort of first graders on what they knew about words in relation to Dibbles. So we were actually using the Dibbles text. Okay. And I mean, the thing to understand about a lot of the assessments is we might be emphasizing at first and second grade words that have consistent word families, but that's not how the test passages have been constructed. So for example, on not on Dibbles 8, but on Dibbles 6, about 18% of the words are multisyllabic at first grade. And keep remembering that in the model, the CBM model, right? You give kids at the beginning of the year what they're going to be expected to know at the end. So that the task is flat on the assessment. And what we basically saw is some kids were already reading when we got the first assessment, which was in the middle of the year. But for the kids in the lowest quartile, they basically had figured out at that point a couple of high frequency words and some phonetically regular words. But the kids in the next quartile, 26 to 50 percentile, those kids really struggled with multisyllabic words. So a lot of the text, when I'm saying we've got a lot of rare words early on, a lot of those rare words are multisyllabic.
Okay.
And my contention is that our students, and I think that's one of the things we're seeing on the NAEP. So if you look at some of the studies that Wang and Sabatini and O'Reilly did at ETS on older kids' ability to figure out new words, turns out when they come to long words, a lot of our kids just don't have a strategy. They've been seeing them in the books we give them. As I said in the presentation, there was a sea change where we stopped having control vocabulary in the early 1990s in the big state adoptions, California and Texas, and then everybody else did it. So I'm just saying the kids are getting a ton of data. And the tests, I think the Dibbles passages are reasonable. I think they reflect high frequency words, some highly, because in any text, there's going to be a degree of decodability. Any text that's written in an alphabetic language, right? And then, but the kids in the bottom half, what they were struggling with was just the volume of words that they've been introduced with. And the very, very lowest, the bottom 25%, just hadn't extracted very much at all. The kids in the 26 through 50, by the end of the year, they had extracted a lot, but the multisyllabic words are still a critical issue. And if you look at our current curricula, typically we don't even address multisyllabic words, till kids are in end of second, beginning of third. And I think I see myself with German. German has very long words. I see a long word and I kind of go, oh no, I can't do that, So this has been really valuable for me to start this, as a learner, and to see what happens when you don't have words repeated. So I don't know how well I answered that, but I think that those assessments are giving you an overall picture, but they aren't giving you the work that I'm doing right now. I'm asking the question, what do kids know and when do they know it? As a result, as the kinds of words. So, are we teaching certain, like in an Orton Gillingham program, are we teaching certain patterns to kids that they already know, but then we never get to the ones that they really struggle with? That's what I'm basically asking.
Okay. Well, I know we're running up on the time here, but I just wanted to say I saw in the chat that someone would like the link that you mentioned. So I wanted to let you know about that. If you could add that to the resources, it would be great.
Yeah.
And if we can,
I also put my hand out in the resources, right? So the whole presentation, I hope, is in the resources. It should be. I'm sorry, I interrupted. Sorry.
No, you're fine. We're right at time, but we did have a question about recommendations for assessing students' vocabulary growth following engagements with conceptually oriented text sets, and how might teachers know their vocabulary instruction is effective. So I don't know if we can fit that in this last minute.
I've been working on an assessment of the core vocabulary. So I think it's always critical to have to know how kids are doing on that core vocabulary. And then to ensure, I think one of the things that you could do is actually look at their semantic maps that they've done as a result of the vocabulary lesson. I think that's going to give you a good idea of their vocabulary. And I think you can keep reviewing that as a way to keep that vocabulary current. So I want to thank everybody. What I was trying to do at the end of the televised presentation was I had some hands clapping, didn't come out very well. So I want to tell everyone thank you for giving me this opportunity. And thank you very much, Christina.
Oh, thank you so much for presenting with us today. It was very informative.
Thanks.